Okay, I think it's the time to start. Is it? Is it not? Are we not ready yet? I think it was.
Absolutely, you can start when you're ready.
Okay.
I've got a 10-minute, 5-minute warning thing for when we get
Okay. Thank you. Okay. Hello, everyone. How are you doing? Cool. Had any good whiskey yesterday? Anyone? Just me? That's nice. Okay, so several months ago, when I found out that there will be Tipsy in Glasgow, I asked my colleagues, so I possibly need to make some talk, and Ovid told me that, okay, you might want to talk about Dow Station, and for example, I made a talk about concept of economic exchange that we use to manage all the payment-related stuff, and people were very interested in it. When I talked about it at another conference, and I said, okay, that sounds good, and started looking at economic exchange. I used them often, but didn't know how they work internally. And when I found out, when I found out that there are some implementation details that I don't like and some stuff that I might want to refactor later, I thought that my talk ended up being called not how to work with economic exchange, but how we got rid of economic exchange. That's why I decided not to make a talk about economic exchange or Dow Station, and I made a talk about Lua. The thing is, I have a friend who has become a stock trader, and once upon a time he asked me to write a trading bot for him, which had to be written in Lua, and I entirely didn't know Lua at the time. I just knew that Lua has a nice community because I visited Lua workshop. And like the website says, Lua is fast, portable, embeddable, small, powerful, but simple and free language, which is pretty nice and can be learned in virtually no time. So I decided to learn it, and what's the first step to learn something? So I tried to find a book. And if we are talking about Perl, we can go to all Perl books website and see that there are about 600 covers of Perl books. That's including 400 in Russian and English, so the languages that I can read. For Lua, it's one book. Like, it limits your choices significantly. So both a good, it's also good in some way, yeah, isn't it? Different editions of this book cover different versions of the language, and the question I had was what version to learn and use. So essentially, to reiterate, there are the dates when these Lua versions were released. There is also LuaJIT, which is compatible with 5.1, which is, I think 5.1 is like one of the versions that, one of the oldest versions that are still used. And LuaJIT primary changes are like JIT compiler itself, which makes it one of the most, like the fastest Lua implementation. It has some library to control JIT compiler behavior. It has a new bit library, FFI library, and C API extension. So, like, Perl 6 for quite a long time was like the ideal language from the future. And LuaJIT is the ideal language from the past. That's because the guy who maintained LuaJIT, who created it, stepped away from the project, and his code was so good that no one can step in and like upgrade LuaJIT to like prepare LuaJIT for versions of to be compatible with higher versions of Lua. So just to have an overview, Lua 5.2 primary changes are go-to statement. It also has a library for bitwise operations. It has like official support for table finalizers. There was such support in Lua 5.1, but kind of unofficial. And variable is a variable that holds the global scope, well, global variables for the current scope. In Lua 5.3, there came integers. Numbers were always floating point, double precision numbers in Lua. Before that, it has built-in bitwise operators, basic UTF-8 support, and like pack and unpack functions, and which tells us somehow that Lua is not backward compatible because, well, if you use goto statement, you can not roll back to Lua 5.1. If you use like bitwise operators in Lua 5.3, you cannot use 5.2 anymore, or you have to refactor your code. So the rule is to always check your target environment before like using it, before like installing Lua onto your computer, because the thing is, Lua is a scriptable and embeddable language, and environment can provide any version. So the authors of this environment integrated long time ago. And so how to get the interpreter actually? Okay, seems like okay. So how to get an interpreter? My requirement was not just install Lua but also luarocks, which is like analog of span for Lua. And doing it in Nix system is mostly pretty straightforward. You can just use your package manager. For macOS, you can use Homebrew. For Windows, it's complicated, and of course, I had to do it for Windows. Okay, so there is a way to install it from official site. You can just get the interpreter from a Lua official site, and you can get luarocks client from luarocks official site. You also have to download make command. You have to get C compiler somewhere. There are several options. After you download all of that and install to your computer, you have to play with the luarocks configuration to adjust linker configuration to load the proper DLL, because otherwise compiled packages won't work. And I found out that it conflicts with Strawberry Perl utils. I didn't try to configure it very intensively, insistently. I just, well, removed produce, sorry. Okay, so there are several distributions that provide automated installations. One of them is luaDist.org. It's kind of a batteries included distribution. Lua itself is promoted as no batteries included thing. And you can download it and read the documentation. But I think I managed to install Lua 5.3 and maybe 5.2, I'm not sure. But I couldn't install 5.1. I'm not sure, it didn't compile. But there is another package called Lua for Windows, which is another batteries included environment and provides Lua 5.1 only. So kind of fulfills the requirements. And here is also a luarocks script, which is a Python script for installing Lua, any version of Lua, and LuaJIT almost on any like popular, I think on any popular operating system, but it requires Python. So if you want to distribute your software to other people, you need to make, using luarocks, you need to make sure that they have Python. Not really great. luarocks itself also ships Lua 5.1. And it was the preferred way for me to install Lua 5.1 because, well, it's pretty like easy and straightforward. You don't need to download and configure compiler separately. But you still need to get make and C somewhere. Well, besides installing the Lua interpreter itself, you need some useful tools like editor, obviously. So, and like the most popular editor for Lua on Windows is ZeroBrain Studio, but it only supports UTF-8 text. It has debugger and code refactoring utilities, I think, so it's pretty good, and it's also written in Lua itself. I couldn't use it because I needed my text to be in Windows encoding. And so I ended up with using Vim and Lua plugins. Actually, many editors support Lua. It's not too hard to do it for them. There is a Lua formatter script, which is simplistic analog of Perl TD for Lua. I don't know, I never used it. I mostly complain that there is no Perl TD for Lua because it's, well, very simplistic and didn't really need to use it. And there is a very useful utility which is called luacheck. It's a static analyzer link and linter. It detects different problems like undefined global variables and unused variables and unreachable code, and kind of similar to Perl critic in that sense. So it's a like must-have in your Lua testing suite, as I think. Okay, so we got the interpreter and can learn some Lua syntax. But have some tea first. The basic, one of the basic units of syntax in Lua is block, and essentially it's just a list of statements. You can use do and add keywords to delimit a block explicitly, which is sometimes useful. I'll tell you why later. And there is such thing as a chunk, which is syntactically is the same thing as block, but it's semantically it's an anonymous function. It can have arguments and can return values. So basically, every piece of Lua code, every script can be considered a chunk, and you can load chunks to in runtime and from file or from string and use them. Lua has global and local variables. If you define variable without any keywords, it's global by default and visible everywhere. And with local keyword, you define a local variable, which is only visible in the current scope, and access to it is faster because the place for it is allocated in stack. Strings in Lua are also pretty straightforward. There is a single quoted string, which doesn't interpolate special escape sequences, and double quoted string, which does. Both of them can only take a single line. And there are also multi-line strings. They don't do interpolation. And there is a special syntax for multi-line string with equal sign between opening and closing square brackets. You can use as many equal signs as you want because, well, to avoid the situation when there is a closing sequence in the string itself. String concatenation operator is double dot. Quite unusual to, well, it's very unusual to have a lot of Perl coding during the day and then switch to Lua and next day switch to Perl again and use, like, you know, double dots and one dot interchangeably, constantly forgetting about it. Comments in Lua are stated by double dash for one line comment and double dash and string for multi-line comment. So as I mentioned already, numbers are double precision floating point values in Lua before 5.3. In 5.3 you have to explicitly specify a fractional part for floating point numbers. Otherwise, they will be integers. Well, before Lua 5.3, any number notation is a floating point. So comparison operator also adds some inconvenience because you can compare for equality using double equal operator, and for inequality you have to use tilde instead of like exclamation mark, like you would normally do in Perl. There is a nil type and value, which means nothing or absence of any useful value. There is a Boolean type, which is also interesting because it has true and false. Nil gets cursed to false value, but everything else, including empty string and zero value, are true values. You can define functions in Lua, and this function declaration actually is identical to this one. So essentially, when you define a function, you define a variable. That's why you can define function globally, as in the first case, and locally, which means that you just define a local variable and assign a function to it. And there is a sugar syntax for that. You can just say local function, and it will be locally visible. Tables is the most interesting mechanism in Lua, because it's the sole data structuring mechanism. It represents different type of arrays. If you need any data structure in pure Lua, you will need to use tables. It have values of table fields can be anything besides nil, because nil essentially stands for empty value or no value. So if you assign nil to a table field, then this field is not existent anymore. So here's an example of array constructor. So you just enumerate values in curly brackets, and here is an associative array. Essentially, for everything which is not a bare word, you need to use square brackets, like for values. Okay, and access to table fields is also like straightforward. You can use a bare word. You can use square brackets to access a value. And Lua understands it, like whether you are understands whether you are accessing an array or hash. So it's the same thing in Lua. An interesting fact about arrays is that array indexing starts with 1. So besides not having 0 as a true value, you also need to remember that array indexing starts as well with 1. So you can't use your normal techniques that you are used to when working with arrays. Lua implements sparse arrays, which is actually a nice feature. It means that it doesn't allocate space when you assign to element number like 1 million or anything like. In Perl, if you do something like that, it assigns, allocates a lot of memory, and if you get this number even higher, you can easily get out of memory error. Array length operator is hash sign. I think it's possibly borrowed from Perl's $hash, because in Lua, last array index and array size are the same things, because indexing starts with 1. And array indexing doesn't play, array length operator doesn't play very well with arrays which contain nils in them. So if you have nil in your array at 3rd position currently, then the behavior is not determined. It's actually implementation specific. In my case, it printed 4, but technically any of 2 or 4 could be printed. Okay, and tables have a very powerful feature called metatables and metamethods. So essentially, we can use set metatable call to assign metatable to any other table. And this metatable can contain a number of metamethods which define how the table behaves, how the table with this metatable behaves. There are metamethods to override arithmetic, comparison string, function, and so on operators, so which is kind of similar to user overload in Perl. And there are metamethods to override array length operators. Index and new index define what happens when you create a new index in a table or access non-existent index, which is kind of similar to tied values in Perl. You can also override garbage collection method, which we can't do in Perl, I think. And there are many standard tables. Env table, as I already said, it contains the global variables for the current chunk, and it defaults to _g, which is the global environment for everything. And modules are typically implemented as tables in Lua, and we'll take a look at that later. There are some syntax difficulties besides the ones I already mentioned. So there is no explicit ternary operator, for example, but you can use and or instead. So make it up. Lua has comparatively poor regular expression library. So, for example, it doesn't have a number quantifier to specify how many times the previous pattern repeats. But you can use PCRE library, which is a separate thing, and possibly LPAG library, which is parsing expression grammars for Lua, but both of them need C compiler, which can be sometimes inconvenient. Return statement should always, well, must always go last. And the only workaround around it, workaround for that is to the last statement in the block, actually. And the workaround for it is to create an explicit block in the middle of the block if you want to return from there. Okay, so functions can be called without parents, but only if the argument is a string or table constructor. So it's okay to like print a string, one string, and dump a certain table, but you cannot just say like print name. There are also benefits of Lua syntax. It has a BNF, which makes it like much easier to create parsers for it. Some constructs are optional, semicolons like and parents for if blocks and loops, and you get used to that very quickly. So when, again, if you switch to Perl periodically, you need to remember to put them back. And actually, it's easy to learn Lua due to its simplicity, so it wasn't bullshitting when people said that it's really easy to learn. So let's take a look how to write a model in Lua. Typically, you define a table and define functions or like values as table fields. And here we are defining point module as a global variable. But this is an old notation, and these days it's better to define a local variable and return it. And when you return it, you have to assign returned value anywhere to some local variable of your script. And since it's not global anymore, it doesn't pollute namespace, so you can call it anything you want. It's not required to be called point, and I got used to call model table like m or _m because just for convenience. And you can simply return a table constructor because you are not bound to variable name anymore. Can be easier for quick hacks. To load the model, you call require model name, which does some checks to determine if model is already loaded, and if not, it loads it by name, and it uses paths from different variables like package.path for pure Lua models and package.path for compiled C models. And package.path is normally taken from environment variables or from the precompiled value. And typically something looks like this. So here you can see that, first of all, it's a semicolon that is used as a delimiter between paths. and that question mark gets replaced with the module name. And another thing is that Lua's require doesn't append the extension itself. It only replaces question mark with the module name, but you can do anything you want with the remaining part of the string. So you can like load some other script and use module name as a directory, like in this example. So when you load module which doesn't contain dots in its name, it simply gets translated to, well, to some module Lua in this example, and its question mark gets replaced with it. And but if the module contains dots, every dot gets replaced with operating system's path separator. Okay, so I learned some Lua, I wrote my script, and then I decided that, well, like it's just one file and it's a rather complex thing, and I possibly need to use some object-oriented program to refactor it properly to classes and to get it easier to maintain. But Lua itself is not an object-oriented language. It has tables though, and tables can help with object orientation. So as I mentioned, there is a metamethod called index, and it can have a value of a function or a table. And index is called when the table is queried for some key which doesn't exist. So here's a quick example of how it works. So we're assigning table to index, and using my class as a metatable. So and when the so set metatable function actually returns like the blessed metatable, yeah, in Perl terms. You would possibly call it bless, and table with a metatable. And when we just query X field on it, and we don't have any fields on the table itself, it queries X field of index field of a metatable. So looking at our point example, we can transform it to object-oriented form like in the following way. So we first assign point. We tell that the point will be a metatable. That the point itself will be a metatable, and it will have index metamethod. So we define a constructor which creates an anonymous table with two fields set in it, and we set metatable to this table to point. And it's worth noting that here the delimiter between module name and function name is actually colon rather than a dotted as it was before. And colon syntax provides self as a first argument in method calls, which is very convenient, of course. So we can use this model like this. So we just load it first and create a local variable named point. It will be class name. And then we create a new object calling new on the class, and we can query X and Y fields, which will be 0 by default. Then we call a method on it, and the method changes values of X and Y. And the last thing, actually I have slides explaining what I'm saying. The last thing is creation of another point object, which just demonstrates that it's another object and that the state of a model of a class didn't change. So this gets us many interesting techniques that are useful for object-oriented programming. So we can use inheritance, for example, by using another class as a metatable for our class. We can have multiple inheritance using the function as the value of index metamethod. We can have private fields and methods by using like local variables and functions, and so on. Well, the thing that we can't have is destructors. And I actually like sub-override model in Perl. Does anyone use it? Yeah, a couple of hands. So it's very useful for testing when you want to mock some subroutine. And essentially, when you have original subroutine, you can override it with another one, no matter in what namespace. You can just say sub-override new and provide an overridden sub. And when you call foo, then it calls overridden sub, not the original one. You have to save like a token, override token for that. And when the token goes out of scope, or gets destroyed somehow, or gets undefined, the function is restored, and when you call it, the original sub is called. I tried to reproduce similar behavior using Lua's GC metamethod, which is called before garbage collection happens. And I created a module. I will not show it here, but I tried to use it in the very similar way. So there was an original sub, and there was an overridden sub, and I called it in the enclosing block, and the overridden one was called, but when I got out of the block, the overridden sub was called again. So I didn't understand what is happening. And the thing is that the execution of each finalizer may occur at any point during the execution of the regular code. So it's not guaranteed that it gets executed right after your variable gets out of scope. So essentially my attempts to build destructors for Lua objects were nothing. Didn't succeed. I think, well, we could actually use garbage collection methods to call garbage collector itself and tell that we need to do garbage collection at a certain point. But I think that is kind of cheating. You cannot provide a library which has destructors in it and say, oh, you know, it doesn't work by default. You have to call garbage collection to make it working manually every time your object gets out of scope. So it's not cool. Well, sometimes it might be really useful, I guess, but maybe not for this purpose. You don't have to do all the object orientation in Lua itself, yourself, actually. You have some OOP frameworks available on the web. One of them is Lua Code, is a port of Perl's code library. Yeah, I like that Lua has many ports of Perl code, and code is one of them. I didn't hear about it before, and I'm not sure that I could find it on Metaspan, but I could find it on sourcespan.org when it was alive. So it's almost like OP framework. It's still it's marked, I think, as beta version or like something like that. So I didn't use it much, but concepts are very interesting. So almost like Moose thing in Lua, which is great. There are other models, like the interesting one is 30log, which is full-featured OP in 30 lines of code. Well, of course, compacted, and there is like an indented version, which is a bit longer. And the model of my choice was middle class, is a object-oriented model with different features like inheritance, roles, class variables, and so on. It was very useful for me, and I think that after talking that, after having some conversations with Lua community, I think that people tend to use it also. And there are many others actually, and you can find a lot of them at Lua users.org wiki page. Lua's standard library is pretty small because, well, as I said, Lua was designed as an embeddable language, and no better is included. So it has functions to manipulate coroutines, modules, strings, UTF-8 stuff, which is new in Lua 5.3. Tables, math, I/O, operating system specific things, and the debug library. To compare, standard library in Perl is like about 200 distributions, very approximate measure actually, but I think it's the real number is even more. So if you need more modules, you can go to luarocks.org website or use luarocks client, and luarocks is unofficial Lua repository. What's the difference?
No, I just think they should have called it clan.
Shouldn't call it client? Okay. Okay. And it's an unofficial Lua model repository. It's not stated, I mean, in programming in Lua or anywhere. I don't think it's considered official by the creators of Lua, but the guy who made it promotes it. And I think that, well, for me it was like a standard thing to have, because it's very similar to Span, to NPM, and to like whatever language you use, you just have a centralized package repository for it. So for me it was must have, but as I found out, it contains much fewer models than on Span, possibly because it's unofficial. So when you look for find file on Metaspan, you get like a dozen of models which work. When you look for find file on luarocks, you get a reference to luacheck module, which is library for loading open raster files, the keyword into love games, love engine, and users which have find and file in their usernames. So, but I wanted a simple library to search for file recursively, and I googled for Lua find file, and I got links to various game engine APIs which have this functionality implemented in them. I had suggestions to write it manually. Well, it's a pretty standard answer in Russian Lua Telegram chat, for example. I'm not sure. I wasn't trying to use a global IRC chat for that purpose. Maybe I should have to, but every time like 90% of times when someone goes to Russian Lua chat and asks for something, the first answer is write it manually, read RFC and implement it. So, and finally I got a link to Lua users wiki page with source code of directory iterator function. So I was quite surprised why the author didn't release it to luarocks after all. So, okay, really don't understand that thing. Well, I probably should have emailed him. I thought of releasing it myself because I think like it's public domain, yeah. But you know, there are too many of such things. So I think it's something that the community should change itself. So the community should learn to publish to luarocks. I'm thinking of making a couple of maybe lightning talks about encouraging people to do that at Lua conferences. Other sources of reusable code include Lua users wiki. It's like the primary source. It's very useful. It has a lot of useful code, many articles, and well, very good source of information. It's very normal to go to GitHub and similar repositories, and unfortunately there are many of them. We got used to go to GitHub in many situations, but after its acquisition by Microsoft, people started to move away. And there are many all-in-one library collections. So there are independent ones, like Penlight library, which has tools for like manipulating tables, for object-oriented programming, for many things that like for which we normally use span, like list util and so on. And there are also product or framework-based libraries. Is the thing that is integrated into the product that uses Lua as a scripting language. So mostly it's game engines, or such things like OpenResty, which is Nginx-based web server using LuaJIT, and the Taranto database, and so on. So I think that in Lua world, copying and pasting is mostly implicitly encouraged. And one thing that annoys me besides that is that model names are inconsistent. So people can tell you to install Lua testmo or Lua file system. You install them, and you need to find out what module to load. It's not called the same way as the distribution. So for Lua testmo, it's test.mo. For Lua file system, it's just LFS. Documentation in Lua is interesting. There is no POD or any replacement of it. Well, I didn't find, maybe I'm wrong, so I'm just talking from my experience, but I tried to find something and didn't. Luarocks doc command, as it stated in its documentation, tries to load the documentation using a series of heuristics. And as I found out, it looks for project homepage using specification. Rock is a file where luarocks package is defined, and looks for files with named like index readme manual with the text HTML or like MD and textile extensions. This documentation is not displayed at luarocks.org website. So the normal flow is you find a model and go to documentation page, which is you will be lucky if it's GitHub home.com and or some kind of documentation platform. Very often it's just maintainer's website, which is broken. Okay, so I wrote a bot. Finally, I refactored it using classes, and I wanted to do some unit testing because, well, to ensure that it works properly, it's finances after all. And the place of testing in Lua's infrastructure is also kind of interesting. So tests for Lua interpreter itself don't run if you install it from source. They are not even the same repository. There was Roberto Yerusalimsky in Russia, and at the workshop I visited, and I asked him why tests are not run. Well, he said that essentially I think that his point was that Lua doesn't have bugs, and you don't. Well, I can see this point actually because Lua is very minimalistic, so maybe. Okay, and tests don't run during model installation. And I don't think there is any specification for tests in luarocks spec. I might be wrong, but well, I don't remember anything like. And I tried to publish a model, a small one, and well, I had tests for it, but I think I didn't find a way to run them during installation. So quite possible that this way doesn't exist at all. Testing section and in programming Lua book is absent. Like it doesn't mention luarocks because it's an official repository. But there is a good resource at Lua users org wiki page at unit testing, and it lists many different unit testing frameworks, and one of them is Busted, one of the best ones. Is behavior-driven development unit testing library with ability to produce different outputs with different assertions, and it can produce dep. And there is Lua unit, which is also for unit testing, but it only works for 5.2 and below. And one of the best ones, Lua test more, which is a port of Perl's test more. Well, it's not a unit testing, yeah, but it's like you can do anything with it, what you want. So I had to write my own wrapper about it, around it, like imitation of test class or test class more, which is based on Lua test more, and I used it quite successfully, although it's just quick and dirty now and work in progress, but still usable. Okay, a couple of words of Lua community, because community is very important in, well, for programmers and for programming languages. The primary communication methods listed at Lua website are Lua mailing list. I think it's like the primary way of communication with developers of the language. There are several IRC Telegram channels, well, and several local user groups which organize meetups, and you can go and meet other people. Not too many user groups, I have to say. So I think the official website lists like 2 or 3 in Europe. That includes London and Moscow, and not sure about Paris because I think that there is some story that they made an application to become a user group, and well, I'm not sure about the story, but Paris is questionable, and a couple in the US. So there are some regular meetups, so some local meetups which can't be counted by, but I was pretty surprised that Russian Lua community is very active. Well, I can see the point because there are a couple of companies that do Lua at work, and one of them even implements their own version of LuaJIT, closed source though, unfortunately. There is occasionally a Lua dev room at FOSDEM, and there is a Lua conference. I think it's typically in Portuguese language, and yearly Lua workshop, which is typically in English, and the next one is 7th and 8th of September in Lithuania. So if anyone is interested, please go and visit it. And I noticed that Lua people tend to make talks at general purpose or game development conferences. So it's not necessary to have a Lua workshop or Lua conference to make a Lua talk, as you could have noticed already. There are communities around products that support Lua, not around Lua itself. So there are many products. I think these are famous and well-known names. World of Warcraft game has support for Lua scripting, and Nginx, and and map. And the community overall is friendly and supportive, and it's a lot of fun to participate in it. So what conclusions I would make from it? Well, first of all, and like the foremost, don't treat Lua as a general purpose language. So I think it's a bit too early to think of it in such terms. It's a scripting and embeddable language, and it's just not just sound. You can help Lua by learning it and releasing a model to luarocks, maybe port some Perl library, and maybe come to Lua conference, meet up and make a talk. Let Lua help you, maybe use it in your project, because it's really useful. It has like a very wide area that I didn't cover, which is Lua C API. I didn't work with C API, but C API is concise and like very convenient, and you can integrate Lua using its API into your projects and have fun. And yeah, I created a bot. It mostly worked. Made a lot of money. Not really. Questions, please. We have a couple of minutes, I think.
What do most people use Lua for that you've come across in the community?
What's the most
common use of Lua that
scripting language, people tend to integrate it. So the question was, what Lua is mostly used for, right? So it's used as a scripting language. So one of the most idiomatic uses I heard of was integrating Lua into nuclear calculations program when the users had to specify parameters of radioactive materials, and the program itself, the engine, was written in like Fortran, and they could enter their own formulas using Lua. So it wasn't easy to do just a simple configuration with that. But with Lua, they could just use formulas. And actually, it's very often used as a gaming script language. So World of Warcraft uses a lot of Lua. So scripting language for everything. Okay, any other questions? Anyone? Okay.